These dioramas tell the story of Ethercall, an epic science fantasy world of my own creation. Today we'll go through the process of building this diorama, and then I will share the short story that inspired the project. Welcome to Horizons.forge. It's time to answer the call. I'll be the first to admit that the thing I struggle with the most is overall composition. I very rarely create a distinct focal point and often use bases that are far too large. There is also usually very little interaction between my models and their world. Also, color choice seems to be an issue. So anyway, today I will use a larger model on a smaller footprint and see if I can create a better composition. We'll start the same way that I usually do on any given project. I'll hop into HeroForge to create a custom character using their extensive selection of customization options. Now obviously HeroForge is not a sponsor, yet maybe, but I really love the ability to make whatever I need in whatever pose I need. I've even been building all of the unique races and ancestries for Ethercall on here. I always print at home as I scale my models up in size, but you can have them printed for you on their world-class printers and even in color. I'll download the STL and drop it into my slicer so I can support and print it on my own home resin 3D printer. It's very important to wear gloves when working with resin as it is quite toxic and you can develop an allergy. This doesn't always happen immediately and can occur over time, so make sure to be diligent. And make sure to rinse the model off heavily with isopropyl alcohol, over 90%, by pouring, shaking, and spraying it. Once I'm sure it's totally clean and free of excess resin, I drop it into a pool of warm, but not boiling, water to soften it up enough to remove the supports cleanly. This part is always so satisfying. This probably isn't really necessary for a diorama model, but I always give my printed models a few minutes in my UV station to finish curing them. On a model printed at a standard 32 or 28mm scale, this normally wouldn't be an issue, but because I increased the size by so much, you can clearly see the handle of his pistol is embedded into his shirt, and there's also some visible unsmoothed mesh. Obviously, this is at no fault to HeroForge, mind you. One of the easiest ways to make a striated cliff face is with broken cork sheets. It's very simple to do and yields a very good result if you know how to clean it up properly. You just simply break pieces off and stack them up. But be mindful to try and avoid making a cork tower and try to think of what rock or cliff would look like. In order to maintain a strong composition, I'm always trying to bring my model back into the picture to make sure I'm not blocking the viewing angle or messing up the scale in any way. I wanted an angled view of the character, who we will learn a lot more about at the end of this video, but I wanted him walking through a pathway of sorts, so I created some cliffs on the side to draw the eye to the character instead of being an open space. From there, I simply started breaking off parts of cork sheeting and stacking them up in believable ways. I even took some time to break up smaller pieces to use as rubble or to glue back together to make taller, small-sized rocks. I used a hot glue gun to put everything together as I was moving fairly quickly at this point, but be aware that hot glue will not squeeze totally flush and will leave gaps, which we will see shortly. I used my utility knife to drag across the cork to make holes and scratches to break up the surface area and also to make the edges look less uniform. More like they have been eroding away together and not freshly stacked pieces. The idea is to make everything blend together and to look as natural as possible, so I tried to do this randomly to avoid creating any patterns. Also, adding material back into the cliffs helps with this natural look so it doesn't look like straight lines. Now, it looks pretty good from above, but when I turn it, you can see all the gaps and it just looks fake. I used some modeling paste, watered down, to A, harden the cork, and to B, fill in those gaps. Anyway, you want it thick enough to fill gaps, but thin enough that it doesn't cover any details and can be easily brushed. Then I used an undiluted glob of it to coat the surface of the canvas to give the earth layer some randomness. I realized that stippling most of these texture pastes usually gives it these unnatural peaks that just don't look good, so I made sure to brush it very lightly to flatten it out. In all honesty, a wet gloved finger would have probably worked much better. I dropped some of that crumbled cork onto the still wet paste to give it some texture that surely will not be completely covered up and impossible to see in the future. Finally, I plotted the point where the character would stand and used the model to determine where his excessively large weapon would be dragging in the dirt. I can say without a shadow of a doubt that I will never, ever make trees again on this channel after this. Anyway, I'm almost out of these plastic tree armatures from Woodland Scenics, so I only have a few small ones left. I ended up foraging for sticks in the backyard, and after baking them for 30 minutes at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, they made the perfect tree trunks. After drilling some holes and gluing them together, I did the oldest trick in the crafting book. By mixing, in this case, super thin CA glue and baking soda, you create an instant super hard bond that fills gaps and has great texture. Now that my trees are too tall and top heavy, I wanted to chop off some branches from the remaining armatures and add them to the new trunk, but I need a helping hand. So I grabbed my helping hands to hold onto the tree and branches so I can work my magic. I love this little thing mostly because it adds to my evil scientist aesthetic. This technique is very slow but ends up looking so good in the end. I think I spent 80% of my time on this project making trees, which weren't even the star of the diorama. Oh well. Now that the branches are in place, I used the back of a dull X-Acto blade to make some consistent texturing and to clean up mold lines on the armature. Always be careful while cutting with anything sharp. Even while cutting away from yourself, you can do damage. After chopping the excess off the bottom of the trunk, I repeated the process 2 more grueling times. I've often seen people use these dried seafoam twigs and adding flock to them to make light, airy looking trees, but I couldn't find any near me, so I tried these wire branches instead. I often find that plain armature branches don't really hold onto the foliage well, and they end up looking like unnatural puffballs at the end of a stick. I tried the super glue trick here again in all of the first few branches, but this proved to be an exercise in madness. My hands were covered in super glue and my desk was an absolute mess. It honestly worked, but took forever as well. So after cleaning everything up and putting away the baking soda, I decided to try another strategy that didn't work much better. I used a brush to spread tacky glue all over the branches, waited about 15 or 20 minutes, and then dipped each wire into the glue as well and hoped for the best. The process was cleaner, but it was so slow and finicky. Each little bump on the desk made the branches just fall off completely. Finally, I gave up and just hot glued them all down to each branch, which looks the worst, but I can cover that up later. I wanted to add a dirt texture to the ground, so I laid down some PVA glue and sprayed it with water to thin it out so I could spread it out evenly. Then I just sprinkled down some sifted dirt from the backyard that I sanitized in the same way that I did the sticks from earlier. It's important that you sanitize anything that you bring in from outside just to remove any insects or bacteria that might not be great to have in the house. One thing that I've noticed is I often spend so much time creating layers of detail that ends up just getting covered up. I think planning better in the long run would help with this problem, and it would save me so much more time. The thing is, I never really know what I'm gonna do in a project. I kind of just do it. Anyway, isopropyl alcohol and watered down Mod Podge sealed it all in. While I finish up the last several steps of this project, let's dive into the story of this diorama. The ether is a mysterious and largely unknown force within the world of Naveni. Although many tech weavers harbor their own beliefs, theories, and hypotheses, none have unraveled its true essence, how it exists, or why it weaves through all life and death. They know only how to manifest it to their whim, to an extent. Its applications are many. Without the ether, there would have been no surge in technological advancements in recent years. No airships would dot the skies, no telomere would grace the horizon, and perhaps the war with Ishvara might never have been kindled. Did the ancestors of Naveni possess a deeper knowledge of the ether's nature and origins? Many believe so, which explains why scores have vanished into the sands of the core desert, digging feverishly for lost treasures and infinite knowledge. In their relentless pursuit of understanding, many have committed grave errors, impacting not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others. Yet, can anyone truly, deeply comprehend something as enigmatic as the ether? Why it beckons so insistently, why it calls, and why is it capable of both wondrous creation and devastating destruction? Zarek, as they were once known, had been wandering for what feels like an eternity, yet simultaneously as if no time has passed at all. The cacophony of screams, shouts, anguish, and pain that once filled their head has begun to harmonize into something more unified, more serene, and oddly joyous. But do not mistake their state for enjoyment. They are profoundly lost, both physically and emotionally. Strange, this feeling of emotion. It wasn't something they really understood. How long had it been? Did it even matter anymore? Instinctively, they began to breathe in and out, an action that should have felt natural, but didn't. Their body, not designed for breathing, felt rigid and forced with each breath. Since it happened, they haven't stopped walking. Shouldn't they be tired? Shouldn't they need rest? Where are we, exactly? Each thought in their head echoed with tens, if not hundreds of voices in unison. Thankfully, they were no longer screams. We, seemed to have relaxed, or perhaps accepted our existence. Days passed as they wandered aimlessly through fields, skirted cliffs, and avoided settlements, yet driven by some semblance of purpose to distance themselves from something, from somewhere. But why? The same voices that urged them to move also whispered to turn back, to eat, to remember a family they never had. At least they weren't screaming. After weeks of endless wandering, Zarek found themselves at the edge of a verdant, luminous forest. As they stepped through the underbrush, each footfall resonated through the trees, a magnificent, almost sacred resonance. Not long after, they found themselves halted by a fallen log. Not their feet trapped, but the massive war maul in their hand dragging across the dirt. "We've carried this the entire way," they noted, eyeing the path carved into the soil by their constant companion. "I wonder if we could find our way back home?" Above, the twilight was barely visible, the sky almost completely obscured. Yet their vision was unimpaired. It almost felt, to them, bright in some way. There was something about this place, the absolute serenity. It comforted one part of them, yet another part was deathly afraid. Zarek paused for a moment, taking a shallow, albeit unnecessary breath. Neha was her name, the one who had created them. Not us, but it, Zarek, her silent sentinel, an amalgamation of magic and machinery, an automaton fueled by ether. She had delved too deeply, driven by solitude and a desire to no longer be alone. Unable to venture beyond her walls, she attempted to bring someone, anyone, to her. "It's only a theory," she would murmur to herself, as she often did while tinkering. "If I can tap into the anima confluence and pull just one into Zarek, maybe then I won't be so alone." Perhaps they could be a tech weaver too. Perhaps they held some arcane knowledge of the ether. At this point, she didn't care who it might be. As she connected her silent creation to a bizarre device of her own design, she trembled with both excitement, but also trepidation. No one, to her knowledge, had ever attempted to extract a soul from the ether before. A soul, she laughed softly to herself, then pointed to the mechanical creature that she herself had crafted. "Some call you an ether soul. Your kind doesn't possess such a thing. Sure, some weavers can instill intelligence or a semblance of humanity within you, but that is no soul. Not like this," she said as she adjusted a dial, causing all of the tech in her workshop to whirl and gyrate. That's when the screaming started. Zarek clawed at their metallic face, screaming in unison with the multitude of voices that suddenly flooded their now sprawling mind. They fell to the ground, racked by an agony so profound, a numb, empty pain that coursed through their body. They felt nothing, yet everything all at once, as if born into the world anew. Neha backed away in terror, her own screams drowned out by the others, and then darkness enveloped everything. For it wasn't one soul that Neha had summoned into her workshop that day, but hundreds, all diverted from the confluence and thrust into existence. Souls? Is that what we are? Were we once people? Were we meant for something else? Why are we here? Zarek found themselves walking again in the lush forest, coming upon a clearing as they gazed up into the skies, the sun now beginning to rise. It's an odd thing to realize one's own existence, To learn what you are, but simultaneously know nothing of your past. In this case, all of our pasts. The anima confluence, they thought to themselves in their spiraling tornado of thought, wondering what it could be and how it crafted their myriad existence. What happened to Neha? Could we have harmed her? She whom they were designed to protect. Were we destined to become connected? Were we connected in past lives? Or had we never actually lived before? Ether powers much of this world, but it does so much more for us. They truly felt the world around them, perhaps for the very first time. The cool breeze that found its way through the labyrinth of the forest, the warmth of the sun as it began to crest over the canopy, the sound of insects chirping in the distance. They clutched their weapon and lifted it effortlessly to their side. There was a moment of silence, of thought. All of this is all of us. They spoke then for the first time, their voice initially a chorus of discordant sounds that gradually melded into a singular, clear voice. It's time we found our place in this world. It's time we went home. Thank you all for joining me on this storytelling journey. I can never thank you all enough for watching. Please take a look at the description below for a link to my stores and my Patreon, and make sure to like and subscribe. As always, thank you for answering the call. I'll see you in the next one.